Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, brought to you and presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I introduce to you Brother Chris Ludke.
This is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to explore Masonry under the Reich. This is going to be part of a 4-part mini-series, or right now it's 4 parts. It could be 5, it could be 3, we're not sure. But at the end of the day, what I want to do is look at Masonry in Nazi Germany. What happened? What happens during the war, but the lead up to it? What sort of ideas come out of it? And I want to look at that cultural furniture, pick it up, and see what runs out from underneath. After all, there's a lot of myth and misunderstanding when it comes to what happened with Masons during World War II. And to do so, I think it's necessary for me to break it up into multiple parts. Today, we're going to do the lead up to the Third Reich, really up to 1933. And then we're going to deal with Masonry under the Reich, which is going to be 1933 up to the war, really about 1938-39. Then we're going to deal with the Forget-Me-Not before turning and looking at Masonry during the war. And I have some interesting things I want to get into there as well. Now, this is not going to follow my usual rhythm. I'm not sure how long this piece is going to be, and I'm going to be honest, it's not scripted. What I have in front of me is all sorts of source material. I have a couple of dissertations, a couple of theses, a couple of books. I've got Sir Richard Evans, The Coming of the Third Reich, William Shirer, Berlin Diary. I've got a lot of different information that I'm drawing together here, and this is very much going to be roughly outlined in front of me. So, without further ado, let's look at this idea of Masonry under the Reich. A little bit of German history to start. Up until, throughout most of history, up until 1870, Germany is not unified. Germany is made up of, at times, hundreds of little duchies and kingdoms that kind of work together and kind of don't. It looks a lot more like Game of Thrones, minus the disappointing 8th season, than it does a really solid country. And when it does come together, you have this constant conflict between more liberal Western ideas that we have in parts of Germany, and then the very conservative militaristic ideas that we see, for example, in Prussia. Now, 1848 rolls around. That's our first key date. And that's where we see some liberal revolutions sweeping across Europe at that time. And Bismarck is going to be getting involved with some of that. And what we see is this idea that Masons are kind of being attacked from multiple sides at that point. The problem is they're liberal revolutions, and the Masons in Germany at the time tend to be a little bit more on the conservative side, which leads to this issue where a liberal revolution just doesn't work well for the Masons. I'm reading from Compass Square and Swastika, Freemasonry in the Third Reich, dissertation by Christopher Campbell Thomas. From the revolutions of 1848 through unification under Bismarck, German Freemasons continued to be much more conservative than their French, English, or Dutch brethren. They supported the monarchy, which is a problem in 1848 because that was a constitutional revolution, or tried to be. So they supported the monarchy. They rejected radical democratic reforms. They absolutely abhorred socialism and Marxism, and above all, were nationalists who supported German unification. For these reasons, Bismarck found it advantageous to found a temporary alliance with the National Liberal Party, which would have been a primary party for any politically active Freemason. So at the time, Bismarck is going to align himself with the Freemasons. Well, that's interesting. Now, this is not the first time that Freemasons are getting involved in politics somewhere. It's really common. But Bismarck's going to do it because he needs that power behind him, because of what's coming. They're going to go to war with Denmark, with Austria, with France. And they're going to do so in 1870, of course, culminating in the Franco-Prussian War in that year. And this is really unification. And the last part that I need to get into in terms of context is industrialization. Germany goes from being a fairly agrarian society prior to 1848 to industrializing rapidly. Actually, they really don't industrialize until about 1870. And then that period from 1870 to World War I, a 40-year period, they industrialize like you wouldn't believe. And this becomes a problem because in many countries, England, for example, industrialization takes over 100 years. And so they don't get the same growing pains that you do in Germany, who's desperately trying to catch up. Because all these little kingdoms and duchies can't really share resources. But I said that we were going to focus on the Masons. And so let's do that. There are three things I want to get into in terms of context that give you an idea of what would have been like to be in Germany. Let's look at World War I. Now, World War I, of course, breaks out. It's something that everyone knew was coming. We have Hugh Strahan and others talking about the fact that this is a nodal point. This is something that everyone knew was coming. You had all of these different crises. People thought the war was coming constantly, starting around 1905. There are some crises earlier, but starting around 1905, and everyone wants to use their brand new weapons. These cool new things called machine guns, airplanes, etc. So they want to play with these things. But things don't work out that well. What they thought would be a 6-week war, something that would be good in sporting for the men, well, it doesn't turn out that way. There's a draft, and almost everyone in Germany is drafted from the age of 16 to 60. If you're a male, you will be drafted. If you are involved in the German war effort, more than likely you will become a casualty. They have casualty rates up to 40%. Many going back after having become a casualty. So, for example, they have a major injury, and the Germans are going to give them a prosthetic arm that'll hold up a rifle. If you want to look into that more, J.G. Meyer does a fantastic book on World War I. And we see these injuries, and we see incredible numbers of German men just wiped out in the war. I mean, it's a meat grinder. It's horrible. And it should end. It should end on November 11th, 1918. What we now celebrate as Armistice Day or Veterans Day in the United States. But it doesn't. And here's where it starts to get dark. This is really the start of our story. You see, the British had blockaded Germany from 1915 all the way until the Treaty of Versailles is signed. Not the end of the war. They didn't lift it when the Germans signed an armistice. They insisted on leaving it in place. And so you end up with incredible suffering throughout Germany. It doesn't matter if you're man, woman, or child. Imagine yourself in a German household. And you're sitting there, you're probably, based on diaries and other information, getting less than 600 calories per person per day. That's 2 Snickers bars. I mean, imagine that. And you might have 3 or 4 kids, 5 kids. And now you have a horrific choice. Do you feed all of them and just watch them all starve, or do you feed it all to Johnny? Because Johnny might make it. The others, not so much. Or do you starve yourself, knowing that your children are going to grow up orphans, and that's going to be a horrific situation as well, because you don't know, you can't protect them, you can't do anything if you're dead. And so out of all of this suffering, out of all of this starvation, we get a conspiracy. You see, the Germans believed, following World War I, that since no enemy troop had ever set foot in Germany during the war, that at the end of the day, it wasn't their fault. They would have won. And maybe they would have. Ludendorff's government, the German military government, will be overturned in November of 1918 and very quickly replaced by a government that goes ahead and signs the armistice. But instead of blaming themselves or the government, many powers that be will start believing in a Jew-Bolshevik conspiracy. This idea that the left, the communists, worked with the Jews. And by the way, when I talk about this, you need to be willing to interchange Jew and Freemason, because international Freemasonry is a huge issue here, as we're going to see. And even Ludendorff is coming out. He's a big one to fight and have these great addresses in front of the Reichstag, where he talks about this great Masonic conspiracy. It goes something like this. These people all work together to end World War I, to cause the Germans to lose. And think about that. At the end of the day, what we're saying is that the Jewish people, and the way the Freemasons come into this, according to Ludendorff and other sources, is that they are the active arm of international Jewry, and I'm using quotes here just to give you context. And at the end of the day, they're tied in to the Bolsheviks, because there's always sort of this fear of Bolshevism in Germany. And so all of it comes together and we get this conspiracy. So that's where it's going to start. And you have to understand, the German Masons are slightly different than what we see elsewhere. They're going to be more conservative than what we see elsewhere. There's a tradition of them supporting the monarchy, as I talked about. The Prussian lodges especially will be particularly conservative. If we look at demographics of Masons in Germany, most of them are going to be older, in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. Now, it's young compared to today, but at the time, it would have been older. They tend to be joiners. These tend to be gentlemen who are into politics or professionals, and they're members of multiple professional organizations as well as the Masons. Masonry in Germany is very exclusive, very expensive. They're not bringing in the working class. This is not going to be all accepting. It has a certain status. And there are multiple Grand Lodges. That goes back to the history of Germany. There is no unified German Grand Lodge at this time. You have Grand Lodges of Prussia. You have the humanitarian Grand Lodges. You have Grand Lodges that are or aren't necessarily entirely accepted, at least not by all of the other Grand Lodges. So there's all sorts of fights going on back and forth. Just as much as Germany is disorganized following World War I, so is Masonry in Germany. And it becomes, well, very problematic. So, of course, what we're going to see is the Nazi Party really beginning to emerge in 1920. And I want to give you a sense of what it's like. So, we're in the Weimar Republic. That's the term for the governments between World War I and the coming of the Nazis. And let me paint a picture for you. Let's say you're a Mason in Germany. Depending on where you are, things could be better or worse. You're going to be attacked on a regular basis by the left wing of politics. And you have to understand, politics in the Weimar Republic are swinging back and forth violently. Every time there's an election, something's happened. By 1923, we have hyperinflation, so they swing back and forth. But at the same time, the communists and the fascists on the right wing, so these are extremists on both sides, are basically developing paramilitaries. We have the stormtroopers on the right, the fascist stormtroopers, the brown shirts, etc. The left has the same thing. And so you have violence in the streets. You have this constant, every time there's an election, they're swinging a little bit further to the extreme on either side. So it's a little more extreme on the right, it's a little more extreme on the left, it's a little more extreme on the right, back and forth. And you lose the Social Democrats and you lose other groups. They're going to be centrists, and things are bad. And from a Masonic perspective, things are really bad because you tend to try and be apolitical. But of course, it's not really apolitical. Many of the lodges are going to tend towards the more right-wing conservative side. Now, I said conservative. That doesn't mean fascist. We're looking at a political spectrum. When we get out on the right-wing extreme, that's where we get into authoritarianism and fascism. So from the right, Masons are being attacked because they're seen as bourgeoisie. They're seen as middle class, the people who are holding down the proletariat, the working class. But on the right, they don't like the Masons either. Some of them do. The old monarchists like them. Bismarck likes them. Hindenburg appears to have liked them. He's the president of the Weimar Republic, especially when you get towards the end. He's the old man of Germany. Everyone respects him. But things are bad. You're going to be attacked on a regular basis. And so that sort of sets us up for what we're getting into. So the Nazi Party, of course, is going to emerge into this. They're coming out of this stew of hatred, this stew of suffering. And they're emerging around 1920. With their emergence, you're going to see attacks against Freemasons increasing exponentially in frequency and ferocity. As such, very few Masons retained any doubts about what lay ahead for them and their fraternity after Adolf Hitler comes to power. And remember, this is happening early. So we're talking 1920, 1923. And they're already reading the tea leaves. And you can imagine that's going to be fairly easy to do, looking at the world and going, hey, this is going to be a problem. And I'm getting that information here from a master's thesis called Fraternal Ties and Nationalist Eyes, The Fate of Freemasonry and the Age of European Nationalism by Dan Bennett of the University of North Georgia. And he does a fantastic thesis here. And so what they're going to do even early on is start to dissociate from different groups. Many groups, many of the Grand Lodges are going to say, you know what, we're going to keep Jews out because we can see that part of the conspiracy. That's a huge issue, so we're going to go ahead and keep them out of the fraternity. But there are reasons why this is happening. As a Mason, you might be looking at some of the issues going on. The Beer Hall Putsch in Munich in 1923. This is a coup that Hitler tries to pull and fails miserably. But it really starts sort of this idea of what's going to be Nazism. And so the problem as a Mason is having a worldview that's going to be cosmopolitan would be out of the question, and having ideas of a universal brotherhood of man without regard to, quote, national differences of race or national origin was also thus in and of itself an idea which demonstrated Jewish domination of Freemasonry according to the Nazis. Here too, it's the essential core of the National Socialist perceptions of Freemasonry, which, although changed through the nationalizing of the fraternity, singled out Freemasons for persecution throughout Germany. Let me read from Mein Kampf. And I'm reading this from A Light in the Darkness by Alexander Herbert. And this is from Mein Kampf. Hitler writes, Chapter 11. To strengthen his political position, he, quote, the Jew, tries to tear down the racial and civil barriers which for a time continue to restrain him at every step. To this end, he fights with all the tenacity innate in him for religious tolerance. And in Freemasonry, which has succumbed to him completely, he has an excellent instrument with which to fight for his aims and put them across. The governing circles and the higher strata of the political and economic bourgeoisie are brought into his nets by the strings of Freemasonry, and never need to suspect what is happening. What he's saying here, and there's more here from Mein Kampf, I'm not going to read all of it. What he's saying is that the Freemasons act as the practical arm of the Jewish faith. The Jewish faith needs to do things. They need world domination. They need international cooperation. They're using the Freemasons for it, according to Hitler. And that's a problem because that's what the Nazis are going to be focusing on. This idea that for a period of time, this idea that the Masons are working with the Jews. And the problem is the lodges are aware of this. Now, some of the scholarship says that they're not, and that's probably not true. Given the amount of Masonic politicians that we see, I think it's pretty clear that many of them know what's going on. They can see what's happening. And so by 1920, you go to a lodge meeting and you might be attacked. You might be attacked on the way in. You might find your building vandalized. You might be faced by brown shirts or stormtroopers coming in to the meeting itself. It's going to be particularly bad. And by the way, remember I said both sides are doing it. The paramilitary arm of the communists are doing the same thing. They're attacking the Masons. The Masons are low-hanging fruit. They're trying to be unbiased and stay in the middle. We know that they're not entirely in the middle, but it doesn't matter. Because when you try and stay in the center in these circumstances, you are everyone's enemy. And that's a huge problem, especially from their perspective. Now, in 1931, jumping ahead a little bit, Nazi Party instructional guides stated that the natural hostility of the peasant against the Jews and his hostility against the Freemason as a servant of the Jew must be worked up into a frenzy. They're going to be looking for scapegoats. And that's where the Bolsheviks, the Jews, the Freemasons come into play. All for different reasons. The Bolsheviks, because their economic system and their equality just doesn't work with the politics of the German right. The Jews, because they historically, going back to Gregory the Great and earlier, have been persecuted throughout Europe. They're low-hanging fruit. They're an easy target. And Freemasons, because they believe that everyone is equal. That's going to be a huge problem, especially in a society where people are seen as unequal based on their religion, ethnicity, racial makeup. And so Masons become dangerous. Masonic thought becomes dangerous. And you have to understand that as we get to the election of December 1932 in January, the appointment of Hitler in January of 1933, that it's not all Germans who are interested in the Nazis. It's about 30%. And by the way, that number is key. Because when it came to the American Civil War, about 30% of the population of the South wanted to secede, and it happened. The American Revolution, about 30% wanted to go ahead and become independent, and it happened. Same with the French Revolution. Same with so many revolutions and changes in history. 30%. Because frequently society is 30% in favor, 30% against, 40 in the middle. Maybe not today, but that's frequently the case. And so they will elect the Nazis. And when they do, they're doing it because they believe, the working class, the middle class, that maybe the Nazis can bring peace. They can end the violence. They can end the attacks against businesses, the attacks against anyone. Because it's not just attacks against Masons and Jews. They're attacking all sorts of people. Anyone who doesn't quite fit the profile of the Nazi Party. And so January 1933, we see Hitler come to power. And Papen, the previous chancellor of Germany, as well as Hindenburg, the old president of Germany, who's now 70 years old and basically dying, believe that they can control him. He's some short little Austrian who got rejected from art school. Come on! How bad can it be? And this is setting up for particularly dangerous times. Because at the end of the day, the Nazis will go after Freemasonry. That hostility is going to grow. We see a minister of agriculture, even just before the Nazis are elected, Dr. Walter Darre, who bluntly declares to a gathering that Freemasons are the enemy of the German peasants who plotted to sabotage Nazi agricultural policies. They are being blamed for everything. And so you're looking around as a Freemason in Germany, and what are you doing? You're not worried about your Masonic ties necessarily and the continuance of the fraternity. I would argue that maybe you're starting to be concerned about your very survival, and you probably should be. Because at the end of the day, the Nazis are going to go after the Freemasons. They're going to take the membership rolls. They're going to take documentation. They're going to arrest them. In some cases, they may be released. In many cases, they are not. And when you put yourself in that position, you can understand some of the choices that are going to be made. The pragmatic choices, because at the end of the day, do I die for my fraternity or do I live for my family? As much as I want this thing to survive, is it really worth my life? And as much as many of us would say today, why, yes, I would absolutely sacrifice, in truth, about 85 or 90% of us would do exactly what we're going to see. We're going to see them follow the rules. Most of them. There's no giant resistance. And we get this idea also from the Germans later on, and from Freemasons writing later on, talking about night and fog, talking about the political prisoners and what they go through. The fact that they don't know what's happening to their home, their family. Idealism is great, but not being dead is better often. So next time, I want to start looking at Masonry under the Reich. We're going to look at the persecution and suppression of Freemasonry in Germany, starting in January of 1933. And we're going to run right up to the war, 1938, 1939. Currently, the third part in the series will look at the Forget-Me-Nots before looking at what Freemasonry looked like in Germany and in the camps during World War II. In many ways, this is hardcore Masonry. This is your opportunity to really begin to understand what your forebears went through and how we got from where we were to where we are. And maybe it gives you a hint of where we're going. But keep in mind, history does not repeat itself. It hums the same tune sometimes, but it doesn't repeat.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org. That's wimasons.org. Learn more about Freemasonry and access more educational content and further light. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wimasons.org. Once again, that email address is education@wisconsinmasons.wimasons.org. Thank you for listening.